Welcome to the Adapting Places podcast. This is episode 2, and it's going to be part 1 of my discussion with Martin Boisen from For the Love of Place, where we talk about conceptual clarity, the differences between place promotion, place marketing, and place branding. For this second episode, Martin's kindly come in to talk to me. He's a Danish geographer with a master's degree from Utrecht University. He lives and works from the heart of the beautiful city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And he's not only a geographer and academic, but also he's a leading advisor and a respected practitioner that helps places develop and use the tools of place branding, place marketing, and place promotion in the correct way. He's also the vice chairman of the International Place Branding Association, who put on an annual conference where key issues in the field get discussed. Breaking this down into 2 episodes, the reason for that was that we talked about some theoretical conceptual clarity in the first part, where we discussed a key paper that Martin wrote around reframing the different concepts of place promotion, place marketing, and place branding. And that's going to be the first bit that you listen to before the second part 2, which would then take you through how this conceptual clarity then give us the opportunity to think about, okay, what does that mean in practice? What does it mean in the context of this current situation that we have, where we've actually been able to see which parts of place promotion, place marketing, and place branding may be deemed essential and which ones may be not essential. So that's going to come in part 2. But for now, part 1, talking about conceptual clarity, and there's a link in the description to the paper. I hope you enjoy the discussion as much as I did. So the 2 episodes will be about 30 minutes each, but we did have a 2-hour long conversation with Martin, for which I'm very thankful, and I'm also thanking in a big way the Place Brand Observer for organizing the interview.
The basic premise of marketing is not necessarily growth. It's about making sure that the demand and the supply meet.
Okay, right.
Right? And that can also mean that an objective for marketing and also for place marketing can basically be to provide better services, where better services are not necessarily economically identified or defined, but are defined as the ones that fits the needs and aspirations of the citizens, for example, or the companies in that city better than now. Right? So it's just, I think that's a really important highlight. I'm not saying that the objective of place marketing should not be growth or whatever, but I'm just saying that it's very important to understand that we can use the knowledge that place marketing brings to the table, that kind of transactional framework, to better our services without wanting to earn more money or attract more people necessarily. It can also just to service the ones that are already there better.
Okay. That makes sense.
And with place branding, it's even more important, right? And it's easier with place branding, as you also hinted. Because in place branding, it can be about, your attachment to the place, your pride, your feeling of comfort, feeling of belonging. And that does not necessarily have to have an economic rationale in it. But then again, politicians, decision makers will, of course, say that those things are important because then you are more likely to stay in that place, you're more likely to invest in that place. And so the economic argument will always be introduced. It's just a question of whether it's the front door or the back door.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And it really makes me think about the place branding aspect, because one of the things you said in one of the YouTube videos I saw was that you actually said something that was that places do not have brands, they are brands.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
I was hoping that you can just elaborate a bit more and if it relates to this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. The thing is, if you define a brand as a set of ideas and associations within the minds of people, right, not as something that somebody wrote down on a piece of paper, or something designed in that sense, right? But the thing that you have in your mind that might be associations, feelings, incentives, attitudes. If that's the brand, then I can mention any number of places, and that will, call that set of associations in your mind. So that means that places are brands. So when I say they don't need brands, they are brands, it's to say, like, you cannot start designing a brand for a place or start developing a brand for a place. I don't believe in that frame. It's a consultancy frame. You cannot do that. You do not start with a blank piece of paper and then, you design what it should be about, or simply just inform yourself about what could be useful for that place. No, the brand of the place already exists, and your humble acknowledgement should be that you can only try to shape that or orchestrate how that develops further, but it's already there. And I think that is a key a realization to be a good consultant in this, but also to be a good scientist. So the vantage point of starting to assess the brand of a city, for example, would not to start looking up the policy documents, because they describe what they hope or what they aspire that brand to be about, but not what it actually is. And the distance between those two, right, what people actually think about the place, what people feel about the place, and what we want them to think and feel about the place, that distance cannot be too large, because then everybody has agreed upon the strategy, but it's simply not feasible, or you cannot realize this in reality. Some people will say that this is the notion that your image and your identity should match, right? But I think that's a semantic fallacy.
Okay. What do you mean?
Well, I think in to that extent, identity of a place doesn't exist, right? It's like your identity is not something that I can discern, right? Your identity is yours, and it's something that you experience from inside you, the superhuman, and your identity is very, very much formed about everybody around you and how you position yourself. A city cannot do such a thing, because a city does not have agency. It's not an entity as such. It's a collective construct. So in that sense, I think it's a semantic fallacy. We're talking about two different forms of image. We're talking about the difference between self-image, how you perceive yourself, and that means in this sense how you perceive your city, and external image, which is how other people perceive your place. And oftentimes I find it very clarifying to think about what you think other people think of your place. Right? I think that one is often forgotten, but that's actually really, really important. We've been using that in Oslo to not only look at the difference between internal perception and external perception, but also to look at what stakeholders in Oslo actually thought that the rest of the world were thinking about Oslo. And then confronting that with what the rest of the world was actually thinking about Oslo. And that's very, very useful for strategy. So I think that's it makes more sense to keep it all, when we're talking place branding, to keep it all in the connotative level of associations and that sort of thing, and not try to make some kind of DNA metaphorical analysis that you can calculate or discern or pin down exactly what the identity is of a place. You can approach it a little bit. Inevitably you will realize that everybody living in a city has their own idea about that city, and you're just looking for the common denominators.
That really puts me at ease, because it's something I've kept thinking about, and even from the geographical standpoint, when they talk about the sense of place, and I was just like, but then how can I know that your sense of place is the same as mine? I definitely can't. I'm pretty sure I can't. And then when we try to talk about this brand, okay, so I've never thought about it as not having intentionality. You can definitely prove that, and then it becomes you take it to its extreme. Okay, but then that doesn't mean that you can't still do things. So when you mentioned it is important to think about asking stakeholders about the misconceptions that they might think others have about them. That is, then you can analyze that and take actions against that, and you can see which ones are true, which ones are false. Okay, because that reminds me of the reasons why I got into the field, having the behavioral economics perspective, because they tend to deal with how our minds tend to have systematic misconceptions, systematic errors. And I was just thinking, are the misconceptions that people have of places that are afar something that I can think about? But then I haven't thought enough about applying it in that sense of the misconceptions we might have about what others might think about us. Okay, and if that's systematic in any way.
Yeah, and I think we've had in geography, we had a concept called meta geography for a long time, which is a good keyword to search in Google Scholar, and that has a lot to do with, for example, perception of distance or perception of qualities of something that is further away, right? And the basic assumption was that when something is further away, then you know little about it, and your image of that will be more stereotypical as a result. Not always true, but a lot of times it is. And then what I wrote about in the 2011 paper on selectivity was to conceptualize this as sort of like voids, as vacuums that the human brain that fills with the first geographical scalar level that it does know. Right. So when I mention a place in Africa, if you know that it's in Africa, but you don't know anything else about it, you will copy your brand of Africa, basically. You will have that define what you think about that place. And then I have to convince you that the preconceived image in your brain is wrong before I can get anywhere with you. Right? So for some countries, it means that they're already, 5-0 behind before they ever get a chance of, showing who they are. I often use the example of Botswana in master classes, right? I mean, it's a pretty stable, pretty good country. Very little corruption, pretty good economy. It's a pretty good example, actually, of a country that's working quite fine. And it would be, according to, I think, Transparency International, I haven't seen the newest numbers, but it would fit perfectly within the European Union in that sense, right? But most people in Europe and in Northern America, they will think Botswana, Africa, it's probably, they're probably having starving kids and corruption and, civil war and whatever and whatnots. But they don't. And that's a pretty crazy example of how the very, very strong brand that is Africa influence everything within that because of our ignorance. But this is a fact, and it's not something that you fix with education, because the world is pretty large and contains a lot of places. And the way the human mind works is that it creates boxes and puts a label on it, and then within that box it puts smaller boxes and so on and so forth. And it's very, very difficult to escape those meta-geographical structures. And for place marketing and place branding, this is essential stuff because it goes down to the street level. I mean, it's not just countries and continents and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely makes me think about the chat I was having with a colleague today, that she had gone for a run in the town she knows, but only now realized that there is another route around, and now she's like, oh, so this is how these two connect, and it's like, yep. Normally, otherwise, you thought it was perfectly, there was something there, but you you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting for me from the side of kind of the misconceptions one, is that you say we can't avoid them, and I think from my own thinking around behavior economics is built on this idea that somehow you can correct them, which I think is not good, because I'm trying to contribute on that side. But I think it's more important to really pay attention to how it works. So how do these leaps of our judgment are made? So what are the rules that people tend to follow? Because then when you describe them, you can start learning where you can help and not educate, but like fill those gaps. So what's their starting point, which I do think relates to the branding. But then if we build brands based on trying to update people's associations of a place, and we start with imagining those that probably know the least, a lot of times then they're the furthest away and actually would benefit the place the least. So I'm
exactly.
trying to think about the tension between attraction and then still keeping the place attractive for residents. So
there are only two, well, actually maybe three dimensions where the people that are very far away can be of importance. One of them is as potential tourists or as potential investors, or in the words of Nicholas Cole, a little bit more relation to public diplomacy, right? So a certain attitude towards your country where you don't want them to do anything, but maybe you want them to agree with their politicians when they do something in favor of your place, and not much more than that, right? So that's definitely, this is why there's this link between place branding and public diplomacy, which is not necessarily transactional. So that's an element that I think is important. Another element which hints to what you're stating is that if we take this notion of mine that the brand is just those associations in your brain, then they are not necessarily contextualized. So you can have the exact same association in your brain, and I might not even try to change the association, but I might try to change the context of that association. Now that sounds complicated, but it basically means that the same thing that you attribute to a place, if you know a little bit more about that thing, a cultural trait or something like that, then you might judge it differently. So you can have the attitude towards that set of associations shift in a positive direction without trying to change the actual associations. And that's what I mean by saying you can try to contextualize it.
Okay.
This is also why it's so important to know what associations people actually have with your place, and not just begin with what you would like them to have. Right. So, and of course, you can start differentiating and segmenting people, and try to figure out whether there's whether you want some people to change their mind, and not just everybody, right? But that's where it becomes more marketing than branding in practice, right? If you start segmenting and you have objectives for transactions and whatever and whatnot. So it's dangerous. I think what might be fruitful is to share very briefly with you how I define a strong brand, right? Okay. When I say a strong brand, I basically just mean that if you ask a lot of people about their associations with Africa, for example, or with Belgium, if those associations match, so if a lot of people have more or less the same associations with that place, then it's a strong brand. It does not say anything about whether it's positive or negative.
Okay.
Because the positive and the negative, that depends on your objective. So I often use examples of, something can be very, very beneficial for tourism and very decremental for inward investment.
Yeah.
So it's a strong brand because everybody thinks the same, but contextualizing it, it plays out wonderful for tourism and not so good for inward investment. You can imagine the cases here. Botswana is actually another one of these, right? The other thing is that if you have more problematic associations in the mix, for example, Belgium, which I just mentioned, then it becomes a frame. So it becomes a stereotypical frame. And that means that everything that happens, that people like to sort of like match those things that they hear about in the news, for example, to that existing frame in their mind. Right? So, for example, Belgium, at least in Europe, has this reputation for being a rather ungovernable country because of, the divide between North and South and, going years without a government and stuff like that. So basically a sort of like chaotic mini version of the European Union, right? That's a frame. And everything that goes wrong in Belgium supports that frame. Even more so, everything that looks like if it might be going wrong in Belgium immediately is put into that frame. So, for example, now it looks like they have more COVID-19 casualties than other countries, depending on their population numbers, which fits into this frame of this chaotic country, which is not governed well. Right? It's a frame. It's not necessarily true. And in that sense, it doesn't really, then you can come and you can say, yeah, but the statistics are gathered differently, they're reported differently than other countries, so you cannot really compare them like this and like that, right? So that you can actually counter this with facts, but it doesn't really matter because it fit into the frame.
Yeah.
Right. This is the same. Every single thing that goes wrong in Africa contributes to the frame of the failed dark continent, and all the positive stories that you can draw out from Ethiopia and whatnot does not really change that. So it's a very, very difficult assignment to go in and change these things. It requires a very, very long-term investment of resources, not just money, but basically thinking power and action. And I think that's something that people are not really realizing to the full extent yet. There are a lot of these. So a strong brand can be beneficial, but it can also be a problem. And to back this up with practice experience as an advisor, most cities, and I work mostly with cities and regions, not that much with countries or lower scalar levels. So most cities that I know which have a very, very strong brand, they're trying to diffuse it, right? Because they're like, okay, so this is very, very good. For example, the city of The Hague has a very, very strong brand as an international city of peace and justice. And cities like that, they have almost a tendency to say, yeah, but that doesn't sell that many hotel beds. Right? So we should also be about the beach. We should also be about this, and we should also be about that. And I completely understand it. I'm not saying it's incompatible, but it's an interesting tendency to note that cities with strong brands, they tend to want to diffuse them a bit. And cities that do not have strong brands, they tend to want to become strong brands, but they are incapable of choosing for what they should then be known. Right. So this is an interesting. I think it's an interesting dilemma.
Okay. Yeah, makes me think about a lot of examples from what I've been thinking about, and also just very personal as well. I mean, as like my hometown, because I'm originally from Bulgaria, it has one of probably the strongest reputations in the country, but it's entirely negative. We're the ultimate, left behind post-industrial town where things are rough and all of that. But the people from within take pride in that. So kind of thinking about where you were brought up as well. If you try to make it better, I would bet you that the people would be against it because they wouldn't be able to identify with the toughness and the roughness that they're used to, like built of iron and all of that. So, right, let me just have a look at some of the other questions that I had after. So we've talked about the clarification, and then I really want to talk about what's essential in the application of these concepts. But just before we move on, I think I had something else. Oh yeah, I guess this one is a bit of a challenge, but let's see your answer. I'm just thinking, if we constantly need to clarify these concepts and why they have to be applied to place in the first place all the time, like what does that say about the grab of these concepts? Sometimes if some of these concepts have an instant grab, they would be taken on board more and be more used more, whereas we're like in place branding, it's constantly having to clarify what we mean, what we're saying, and constantly clarify what we mean. I guess, is there such a should they be in the same field, these three concepts? I guess is at the core of the question, the place promotion, place marketing, place branding, because sometimes I've really thought about, like, even in the not even just in places, but is it the time when you realize that branding probably actually is harmed by marketing a lot of times, when you're like, well, I definitely stand for that, but if I sell out to the audience that I don't want for a bit, I'm going to make some more money, but then I'm not gonna, it's going to dilute what I stand for. So this is kind of where this question is coming from.
Well, tough one. Do they belong to the same field? Yes and no. Yes, because to me, it doesn't make sense to talk about doing place branding without doing place marketing and place promotion, right? You can choose to do place marketing without trying to do place branding, in the sense that you say, well, I don't have guidelines. I don't have a specific image that I want to sustain or protect or orchestrate. I don't care about the reputation. I'm just going to do the thing that, brings me the most money or the most people, whatever. I'm going to try to build, a proposition, and those proposition can be mutually incohesive or whatever, as long as they move people in the direction that I want them to do. Right? That's possible. With that said, whether cities and regions and countries use these terms or not, they have been doing this forever, right? So it's not new. The only thing that's new is the terminology, and the attempt to conceptualize this, to bring a little bit more clarity into what cities are actually doing for which purposes. Because if we allow the semantic, conceptual, terminological confusion to exist, cities will, for example, launch a promotional campaign and think that they have solved the marketing and branding issue, right? And that's the thing that we cannot have happen. And I don't think that every single city necessarily should hire us to do place branding, strategic work, or whatever. But I do think that they should think thoroughly about these things. So that's, I think that's one point of clarification. I think it's very important to have this historical perspective, that cities and regions and countries have been doing this forever. It's just that we now have a different set of terms, to distinguish what they're doing.
Yeah, that's good.
The tools are changing.
Yeah,
right.
It's really interesting.
The first two cities next to each other in Mesopotamia, they probably also battled for the reputation and the street cred of their leaders and all these different things. I'm pretty sure they didn't call it place branding, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, Well, that's quite an interesting one. How the tools that we've got then change the terminology of describing maybe things that have existed for a very long time. Yeah, that really makes me think about um, one of the questions I wanted to ask around. So we're using the marketing language, but now a lot of the image that is seen by
Mm,
people from afar is done digitally, and there is a whole set of tools that are being used there, especially in the world that I tend to live in. My day job is around UX, and sounds futuristic, but a lot of the things is just, to me, a lot of, again, experiential things, so user experience research. And I can see how understanding how people interact with the digital presence of place brands can be used just as well to describe some of the processes. At what point um, is it useful to keep using new language to the same topic, and what
mm,
at one point does it become not so useful because we're not having the same discussion anymore? I think that's
mm.
my question.
Yeah. Um, well, first of all, language is not neutral, right? It's never neutral. So determining whether this interview is about place branding or place marketing is already a funny one, right? It's the place brand observer, not the place marketing observer. Why?
This is the end of part one of the second episode. Part two will be coming soon, where we'll continue with our discussion around the practical application of the conceptual clarity that Martin has proposed. Take care.